June 12, 1971, 427 East 83rd Street, Manhattan, New York City. Detectives stood over the lifeless body of Cornelia Michael Crilly. The 23-year-old TWA flight attendant was found dead in her apartment, strangled by her own nylon stockings, bite marks on her chest. She wasn't just a victim, she was the first known target of a man who would become one of the most infamous killers in American history. He was a photographer and self-described artist who promised that if his subjects posed for him, he'd make them famous. That was true, but not in the way they were expecting. He was a serial killer of the sadistic variety, his crimes fueled by a dangerous mix of fake charm and razor-sharp intelligence. But it wasn't just his brutality that made him infamous, it was his brazen audacity. At the height of his killing spree, he stepped into the spotlight appearing on a primetime American dating show. He seemed to revel in hiding in plain sight, using his wits and sharp mind as a weapon. The same qualities that should have raised flags made him invisible. So how did they finally get him? That's what we'll reveal on this episode of The Infographic Show. How they finally caught the serial killer with the highest IQ. On September 13, 1978, millions of Americans settled down to watch the matchmaking TV show The Dating Game. Among the lineup of eligible bachelors was Rodney Alcala, introduced as a photographer who in his spare time enjoyed skydiving and motorcycling. His bio didn't include the fact that he liked killing women. It left out most of the chilling details. The part where he enjoyed toying with their minds, watching as fear consumed them. He'd sometimes strangle them to the point of death only to let them regain consciousness and relive their terror. He was, in short, a beast. Not the kind that hid in the shadows, but the kind that walked boldly among the public. A charming, attractive figure who wore his sheep's clothing well. Alcala flashed his best fake smile as the Bachelorette said, "I am serving you for dinner. What are you called and what do you look like?" With the charm of a practiced showman, he responded, "I'm called a banana and I look really good." A wave of laughter rippled through the unsuspecting audience. Reading from her pre-made script, she asked him to be a little more descriptive. Alcala's voice developed a playful tone, one laced with innuendo, as he said, "Peel me." The double entendre sent the Bachelorette into fits of laughter, cracked her up, and brought enthusiastic clapping from the audience. He ended up winning the game. As the audience cheered, Alcala's grin told a different story, one of hatred and danger, simmering just beneath the surface. The prize was free tennis lessons and a trip to the Magic Mountain theme park. But Rodney and her would never meet. She might have been on a game show asking inane questions, but she was perceptive. Behind the playful banter and laughter, something about him just didn't sit right. She called the producer to cancel the date, explaining that her bachelor was just too creepy. He gave off weird vibes and made her feel uncomfortable. It was a moment of intuition that might have saved her life. If the show had bothered to do a background check, they might have found out that he was a sex offender. Alcala evaded capture by slipping through the net, using fake names during his multi-state killing spree. But on the show, he'd chosen to be himself. By the time he smiled for the cameras, he had likely already killed dozens. His name had even been on the FBI's most wanted list. Yet, he decided to appear on a show that was watched by millions of people. His compulsion to torture people and photograph them likely took hold of him in 1968. It was a summer of love in the USA when the girls of California wore flowers in their hair and preached about love. Alcala looked like a perfect fit for the era, that year picking up a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree at UCLA. To anyone who met him, he was the kind of creative free spirit that was popular with the hippie girls of the 60s. He'd given himself a makeover, grown his hair long, and picked up a camera. This was a very different man from the one who had earlier had a nervous breakdown in the U.S. Army. He was discharged in 1964 after suffering from a nervous breakdown. There were also allegations of sexual misconduct. He was manipulative and mean, said the Army, a far cry from the guy who showed off his art degree 4 years later. His dark side was evident in 1968 when he lured 8-year-old Tali Shapiro back to his apartment in Hollywood. A passerby had seen her getting into Alcala's car on Sunset Boulevard and followed them to Alcala's place on DeLongpre Avenue. When the man saw them enter the apartment, his unease grew. He picked up the phone and called the police, unknowingly setting the stage for a pivotal moment in Alcala's dark history. By the time the two uniformed cops knocked on the door, Alcala had already subjected the young girl to unspeakable horrors. He had assaulted her, his cruelty escalating to a brutal attack with a metal pipe. Officer Chris Camacho demanded access to the apartment, but Alcala delayed, claiming he was in the shower. After a few moments, he briefly appeared at the door, his calm demeanor and composed expression masking the horror within. Alcala tried to stall even more, Camacho, rightly thinking this could be a matter of life or death, kicked in the door. As he did, Alcala fled, pushing past the officers and out through an exit. Camacho and his colleague now had a choice to try to save the girl's life or give chase, and they decided to stay. The image of what Camacho saw would stay with him forever. She had been beaten so badly he was sure she was dead. Alcala had not just beaten her with the pipe, he'd pushed it hard up against her neck. The police were sure she was dead. When they removed the pipe, they heard a groan. She was unconscious but alive. Shapiro was rushed to the hospital where she would remain in a coma for 32 days. Her survival was nothing short of miraculous, but her ordeal was far from over. When she finally regained consciousness, she recounted the terrifying moments leading up to her abduction. At first, she had refused to get in the car, but he insisted he knew her parents, warning her she'd get in trouble if she didn't go with him. Many years in the future, she'll meet him again, and things will be very different. This was a serious crime, so there was a major investigation. Leading it was LA Police Detective Steve Hodel, Hollywood Division, Juvenile Detail. He made sure Alcala was put on the FBI's most wanted list, and the cops interviewed the professors and students at UCLA. Most of them didn't believe it, saying no way was Alcala that kind of man. To them, he was a sophisticated and intelligent artistic man, a popular figure around campus. That was the thing about Alcala, he knew how to be popular. He could play the game, especially when he was hanging around people in the art scene. And where better to be an artist than in New York City? That's where he went next to enroll at NYU Film School under the alias John Berger. As he was planning his next attack in the East, the police back in California found among Alcala's clothes and equipment some photographs of mainly girls and young women posing for him. This was not a good sign. If he could get that many girls to model for him, it was almost certain he'd attacked people in the past, and he would do it again. Of course, there were plenty of pretty women at film school who'd jump at the chance to be snapped by a professional, especially one who was handsome and shared their artistic ambitions. He wasn't just any photographer. He had studied at the same prestigious school as Roman Polanski, an up-and-coming director whose name alone carried weight. The Upper East Side in Manhattan was the location of Alcala's first murder, at least the first murder on record. At the time, it was a fashionable and bustling neighborhood, popular with air stewardesses and secretaries. A perfect hunting ground for someone like him. Suffice it to say, there were plenty of women eager for the chance to be photographed by a guy who told them he would enter their pretty faces into competitions. This was how Cornelia Michael Crilly met him, who was found in her apartment with her stockings around her neck. As was customary with Alcala's victims, he had posed the body. In the worlds of serial killers, posing or staging is what's known as a signature, something the killer does, sometimes unique, as if in a ritual. Posing was part of Alcala's depraved fantasies, an artistic expression of his utter domination. He also took trophies from his victims, another kind of signature. For a while, Crilly's boyfriend, Leon Borstein, was on the suspect list. He'd been living with Crilly, but only on a temporary basis. He'd helped her move her things into the new place, which she was sharing with another flight attendant. He got home from work that day to find the door locked. There was no answer when he knocked, and no one picked up the phone when he called, even though he was certain she was home. The cops soon arrived, only to be met with a scene of unspeakable horror. Before them lied the devastating evidence of a depraved mind at work. Not only had she been strangled, but there was a bite mark on her body and something had been stuffed into her mouth, clearly to silence the screams. It was a terrible crime, but given that year around 2,000 people were murdered in the Big Apple, the investigation was slow. Without today's forensic capabilities, the case went cold, and it would remain that way for 40 years. Unsurprisingly, Alcala moved again, changing his name but only slightly. He became John Berger with a U instead of an E. His destination was New Hampshire, where he secured the kind of job tailor-made for someone trying to mask their true nature behind a facade of respectability. At an arts and drama camp at Lake Sinape, he became a counselor for young girls, a chilling choice for a deviant maniac looking to exploit his access to vulnerable victims. During a rainstorm in the summer months at the camp, two girls ran into a post office in the village of George Mills when one of them noticed a wanted poster. The face staring back at them looked uncannily like their camp counselor, Mr. Berger. The name listed was Rodney Alcala, and he was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. They told the dean, and a few minutes later he was on the phone to Detective Hodel back in California. So, just after a few months as a counselor, Alcala was extradited back to California to face the music for the attack on young Tali Shapiro. He was looking at a hefty prison sentence, but the family had already moved to Mexico, and they refused to allow their traumatized little girl to testify. She'd already endured unimaginable pain, and her parents couldn't bear to subject her to the anguish of reliving the ordeal in court. Without the main witness, the prosecution offered Alcala a plea deal, and he got off with a 1-year to life sentence for molestation, and his name was on the sex offender registry. The light sentence stunned those like Officer Camacho who had seen what he had done to that poor girl. They were stunned a second time when they heard he became a free man again after just 34 months. This devious and violent charmer of women, a master manipulator, was not going to stop, and Camacho knew it. He was right. After just 2 months of freedom, Alcala was arrested again, this time for picking up a 13-year-old girl when she was on her way to school. He persuaded her to get in with him. Once he had her driven to a secluded location, his demeanor shifted, and he forced himself on her, attempting to kiss her as she struggled to resist. But unlike many of his victims, she lived to tell her story. Bravely, she reported him, leading to his arrest and a 2-year prison sentence. He was obviously a danger to society, but with that high intelligence of his, he managed to persuade the parole board that he was a reformed man. The parole officer even let him travel across the country. He went back to New York City, where police already had their hands full with a serial killer the media was calling the Son of Sam. Alcala was there just a week when he murdered 23-year-old Ellen Jane Hover, a wealthy socialite, musician, and artist, whose godparents were Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. Her dad had been a big shot in Hollywood, a nightclub owner and a friend to the stars. For that reason, when she went missing, it was front-page news. In her calendar, she had marked a meeting with a photographer who she called John Berger. Police interviewed her boyfriend, and he said he'd recently asked her who was the creepy guy that she'd been hanging out with. Alcala would soon appear on a popular TV show, despite the fact so many people knew his face and they could connect him to missing or murdered women. He was as brazen as they come. He had some of those traits of a typical psychopath: superficial charm, deceitfulness, risky behavior, and a grandiose sense of self-worth. Like so many serial killers in history, he probably thought he was smarter than everyone else. Hover's stepdad, Reuben Schwartz, a wealthy garment district lawyer, put up a $100,000 reward, but the case went cold. Hover remained a missing person until her body was found in 1978, buried in a scenic spot overlooking the Hudson. It would later be discovered that an up-and-coming photographer had taken another young woman's photo there, though this girl was lucky enough to tell the story. Who knows how many young women eager for a chance to be photographed by a professional fell victim to Alcala in New York. What is certain is that the number of his victims is far greater than the charges he would one day face. He traveled extensively, moving from city to city, leaving a trail of fear and devastation in his wake. In Wyoming, he crossed paths with Christine, a good-looking, pregnant, free-spirited woman who was motorbiking across America. She vanished without a trace. He returned to LA in 1978, where he landed a job as a typesetter for the LA Times. Once he got to know his colleagues, he started showing them what he called his artwork. There were many hundreds of pictures he'd taken, mostly of young girls but also young boys. He was convincing, especially when he said prizes were involved. One of the many women he photographed later said that he was easy to trust. He had a way of talking to people that really put them at ease. This was around the same time he played the dating game but was rejected by the woman who made the mistake of choosing him. It's believed he couldn't handle rejection after his Mexican-American dad abandoned the family when he was still very young. Still, unlike so many other serial killers, it doesn't look like his childhood was especially traumatic. In the private schools he attended, he was a gifted student, a good athlete, the kind of guy who had nice things said about him in the yearbook. Still, he was definitely unusual. It was only 4 years after he enlisted at age 17 that he had a nervous breakdown and was called manipulative and psychologically unstable. Back in Los Angeles, and just before Alcala's infamous game show appearance, police made a grim discovery. The body of an 18-year-old runaway, Jill Barcombe, was found, a brutalized victim whose murder bore the hallmarks of a depraved mind. Investigators believed her death was the work of a serial killer known as the Hillside Strangler, who, like Alcala, abducted, tortured, and killed girls and young women. Standing at 5 feet and weighing just 100 pounds, Barcombe was picked up on Sunset Boulevard. Her body was found close to the actor Marlon Brando's house on Mulholland Drive. She was naked and in a kneeling position, so almost certainly had been deliberately posed. Her skull had been crushed by a rock that was found nearby, and she had been strangled multiple times with a belt, pantyhose, and with one of her pant legs. As for the triple asphyxiation, whoever did this wanted to see the victim suffer prolonged agony. Just a month later, Alcala forced his way into the Malibu apartment of a 27-year-old nurse named Georgia Marie Wickstead. Her body was found posed in the bedroom. She had been hit on the head, mutilated, and strangled with stockings. Bodies were being found all over LA. Since Alcala was on the sex offenders list, he was looked at by the Hillside Strangler Task Force. They interviewed him at his mother's house, but at this point he was not high on the list of suspects. They actually arrested him for marijuana possession, and he spent a little while in jail, but he was soon out again, telling strangers he wanted to shoot them for his portfolio. His next victim was Charlotte Lamb, a 32-year-old legal secretary who was found strangled by shoelaces in the laundry room of her apartment complex in El Segundo. Again, the body had been posed. She had also had her earrings stolen, something Alcala would one day regret. Then in February 1979, he picked up a 15-year-old hitchhiker in Riverside County. The girl, Monique Hoyt, first went to his apartment and later he drove her out to Joshua Tree, where he bound and beat her. He photographed her, but he didn't kill her, taking her back to the city where she called the police from a motel. Alcala was jailed, but his mom posted bail and he was soon back out looking for more victims. In June 1979, he murdered 21-year-old Jill Parenteau, a computer key punch operator who'd skipped out of work early to attend a baseball game. The next day, she failed to show up for work. She was found in her apartment, posed and naked in the bathroom, beaten and strangled. This time, the killer left a clue. He had cut himself climbing through a window and left spots of blood. Forensic DNA technology was not yet invented, but the presence of blood at a crime scene was still very useful to police as a way to whittle down a list of suspects. What was also useful is one of Parenteau's friends said that she had been hanging out with a guy at the club. And yes, if she saw his face, she would remember him. Alcala's reign of terror was coming to an end. He was getting desperate and sloppy. His world was closing in on him. On June 20th, 1979, Robin Samso, a 12-year-old from Huntington Beach, borrowed her friend's bicycle so she could get to ballet class. She didn't make it. Her body was later found rotting away in the foothills of the Sierra Madres. But the day she went missing, a neighbor, Jackie Young, had seen Samso and a friend, Bridget Wilvert, playing near the beach. She saw a man trying to take photos of them as they frolicked in their swimsuits. The woman would chase the man away, but Young and Wilvert would remember the man's face. In fact, quite a few people saw him around the beach that day trying to convince young girls to pose for him. It was only because a neighbor intervened that he left, apparently looking very upset. Samso needed to get to ballet class and Wilvert said, "Take my bike," and that was the last time Wilvert saw her friend alive. 12 days after Samso went missing, William Popke, a U.S. Parks Ranger, found her decomposing body, as well as a kitchen knife and a pair of shoes lying close by. Dane Krappa, another park ranger, said that she'd seen a guy taking a girl down to the same wooded area. She'd also seen the car he drove, a Datsun F10, the same type of car Alcala drove. Police now had a composite sketch from Wilvert's description. Alcala's parole officer saw it and he was pretty sure that was his guy. After all, there weren't too many sex offenders with long curly hair around who had just been arrested for picking up children. On July 24, 1979, police arrested Alcala at his mother's place in Monterey Park and charged him with the murder of Samso. It was a major breakthrough in their investigation, but what they uncovered next would reveal the staggering scope of his crimes. At the house, they found a receipt for a storage locker in Seattle. When they went to open it, they were met with a chilling discovery. They found a trove of photos of girls, boys, and women. Among the items that they found were 2 pairs of earrings, one of which would later be identified as a trophy from the murder of Charlotte Lamb. There was no way he was going to get himself out of this. But what police didn't know right then was the full extent of his crimes. In 1980, he was found guilty of Samso's murder and sentenced to death. He might have died then and there, as Mary Ann Connolly, Samso's mother, had sneaked a .25 caliber pistol into the trial. She intended to use it if justice wasn't served. Connolly later admitted that her desire for revenge was fueled by the fear that the system would fail her daughter. She felt like doing that again when just a year after his sentencing, she opened a newspaper to see that the California State Supreme Court ruled that Alcala had not received a fair trial. The jury had heard about his previous crimes, which according to the article had prejudiced their decision. It would take decades to prove many of the other murders were his, including the New York cases of Ellen Hover and Cornelia Crilly. He'd been a major suspect in many others. When in 2010, the police made public 120 photographs he'd taken over the years, 21 women identified themselves, and at least 6 families identified someone who had disappeared in the past. Many of the people in those shots remain unidentified to this day. Moreover, police held 900 photos back because they didn't think the public needed to see sexually explicit poses, and there's a very good chance they included many more of his victims. At his 2010 trial, he was convicted of murdering Barcombe, Wickstead, Lamb, and Parenteau. Choosing to represent himself, he addressed himself in a deeper voice as Mr. Alcala. If that wasn't strange enough, in his closing argument, he told the jury that if they gave him the death penalty, they too would be murderers. In 2016, he was charged with another murder, and the woman had indeed appeared in those photographs. She was 28-year-old Christine Ruth Thornton, the pregnant motorbiker in Wyoming. The location proved Alcala had spread his wings far and wide. Described as a free spirit, she'd been traveling to Montana in 1977 to pan for gold after splitting with her boyfriend. She was 3 months pregnant at the time that she vanished. Her mom spent the next 39 years looking for her, and then in 2013, her son sent her an email with pictures attached. One of them was a good-looking woman on a motorbike, one of many photos from Alcala's vast collection. It was her daughter, all those years ago before she went missing. The mother submitted her DNA to a database of missing persons. That blood was eventually matched with the bones of a person found buried just yards from where that photo of Christine was taken. Alcala had more than likely killed her just moments after he took that shot, and he told her he would make her famous. He was an old man when that discovery was made. Still, a detective went to see him at the medical unit of Coracon Prison near Fresno, where he was being treated for dementia. The detective showed him photos of that location, to which he said in surprise, "I know that area. That's my area." He was then handed the photo of Christine on a bike. Alcala would spend the next 5 minutes tracing his index finger over the photograph. He kept on tapping it, playing mind games with the detective. He wouldn't admit to killing Christine, but he admitted he had been there with her. It was enough to charge him with first-degree murder, but he never stood trial for it. He died in the prison hospital of a heart attack in 2021, age 77. The full extent of his crimes may never be known, and the scars he left on countless families will never fully heal. What do you think about Rodney Alcala's horrifying double life? How did he fool so many, even on live TV? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear your take. Now watch a story about a serial killer you might even feel sorry for. The disturbing story of 11-year-old serial killer. Or have a look at one of our deep dives on killers, the most infamous serial killer, how he did it.